and thank you to all of our participants and constituents. Ed Yanka is a great friend of the office. He really doesn't need an introduction for those of you who kind of pay attention to civic affairs, especially in the Chicago area. He's with the ACLU, and he has served as their primary spokesperson. He's been there for 26 years, and but he's more than just a spokesperson. He also does a lot of their policy. He is deeply familiar with the law, a lawyer himself. He has litigated a number of matters as well. But all that being said, perhaps he just donned his most important role last Friday, which is he became a grandfather for the first time. And so his little baby granddaughter was born in Chicago on Friday, and in between, taking care of her and all of his other duties, he decided to join us, and he agreed to take our questions, and we have a lot of them. We also have a big audience today, and so maybe we'll get started right now, Ed, with you kind of leading the way. And just as a reminder to everybody, this is a governmental town hall. I know certain people might have questions about politics and that type of thing. I'm not really allowed to get into that here in this setting, but we're going to try to keep our comments and questions more substantively focused on the executive orders and what are the ramifications, what can we do about them, and how do we conduct ourselves as individuals and NGOs and others who are affected by them as well. So with that, Ed, could you please give us some introductory remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. It's great to be with you and with your members, with your constituents from across the district. I think there's really two ways of kind of thinking about what we've seen over the last month since the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second term. And the first is really the efforts to coalesce or to draw together virtually all the powers of the federal government into the executive. And we see this in a number of ways. You've mentioned one, these sort of broad-ranging executive orders that seek to dictate policy across the country for everyone simply at the stroke of a pen. The second way is really through the use of funding and federal funding, both as a coercion to adopt particular policies, but really in a way that kind of upsets the very kind of framework of our government. For those of you who are on the call today who grew up in a more gentle time like me, where we learned our government by watching, Saturday morning cartoons and the and learned about the three divisions of government, the three branches of government, and how they work, you know that balance is meant to keep any one branch from having too much authority over others. And what the administration has really sought to do is to take away from Congress the power of the purse in order to enact and enforce their policies across the country. And then I think what we see is the use of that power in many ways as a lever really to try to target or harm particular groups of people, trampling on their rights in many ways as we see it as an organization. And so I think there's a lot for folks to pay attention to be mindful of, and to think about ways in which we can, push back and be present in terms of confronting some of these things that, again, not only harm individuals or could harm individuals, but also really do damage to the very structure of the government that we've had for so long.
Thank you, Ed. We have numerous questions that have come in just literally within the last 3 minutes. I'm going to ask a couple, and then I'm just going to turn to the questions from the audience. Let me first say, the first question was, how do we get in touch with your office? So let me answer that question first, because I think that a lot of individuals will want to have our private counsel, get our private assistance. Our phone number is 847-413-1959. That's 847-413-1959. If you prefer to email us, it is il08.helpline@mail.house.gov. And of course, you can reach me online at our website as well, Krishnamoorthi.house.gov, and there are ways to contact us through that link. Ed, in your opinion, what do you think are the most important of all the executive orders that came out? It's kind of astonishing in terms of their breadth. There's everything from, what I call mundane executive orders, that kind of typical executive order, in this case, something that would ban paper straws throughout the government. There's actually an executive order on that, to something as profound as, it looks like we're reversing or rescinding the executive order from Lyndon Johnson with regard to, trying to have a more diverse workforce, or of course, ending birthright citizenship, which is another executive order altogether. What do you kind of consider to be the most far-reaching
Yeah.
of the ones you've seen so far?
It's a really good question, Congressman. And it's interesting. I will just tell you, sort of in my circle of friends, in that the banning paper straws one was one that was at least a little bit more popular as it happened. I think there are a lot of people who are frustrated over straws, much more than I ever knew. I think there's a couple that for me feel very, very much far reaching. The first one you mentioned, which is the one that would seek to rewrite the 14th Amendment to the Constitution with regard to birthright citizenship, and going forward, not provide birthright citizenship to people who are born in the United States to parents who are not citizens. As you may know, there was a lot of debate actually at the time of the 14th Amendment. It was considered that we needed a constitutional amendment because simply a statute that made people citizens who had been formerly enslaved was not enough. There was a broad range of discussion then about who would be included. And in fact, we've operated under the Birthright Citizenship Amendment as it's been since that time, and no one has ever questioned it until now. The idea that we can change that with the stroke of a presidential pen, I think, is something that feels very, very much troubling, if that's what is possible, because again, we could see a careening back and forth of constitutional interpretations. The second one that I think is really far-reaching and is troubling, another one that you mentioned, is the one that actually rolls back federal hiring practices to before the adoption of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That says that the government will not look to increase the diversity or increase opportunities for people from different and diverse backgrounds to be part of service in the federal government. That, and when you combine that with some rollbacks of contracting opportunities with the federal government, I think those are things that, again, seem to push people aside in society and really raise kind of fundamental questions. The other one, I think, another one that I think, you put in the category of being somewhat troubling is the one that suggests that the federal government will now create what they describe as a patriotic curriculum for all public schools across the United States to adopt. I'm not sure exactly what they mean by a patriotic curricula, and I think we all have differing ideas about what a curricula should be. And in fact, that's one of the reasons we've most often left that to local governments, to be sure, and local school boards to decide what their curricula is. And one of the concerns here is that curricula seems to be linked to money, and so I would add that one to be concerned about. And the last one that I would just mention briefly is one which has been challenged and already blocked, but again, would seek to deny any federal funding to healthcare providers who provide gender affirming care to people who are 19 years of age and under. I emphasize a couple of things there. The idea of federal government deciding what healthcare is across the country is something that we haven't heretofore seen. But the other element of that is, of course, this idea that it could deny healthcare and recognized worldwide recognized healthcare, not just to youth, but to people who are actually legal adults who may be have their own healthcare insurance and et cetera. So I think that those are the things that we see that are especially troubling. I would put in the first group or the highest group where we have the most concern.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question. Litigation. There's litigation all over the place right now. I guess, how does an individual or an organization that might be implicated by these presidential orders conduct themselves with regard to this litigation? My understanding is that, at least at the federal level, if a district court pauses an executive action, that would apply throughout the country, at least until a higher court or the Supreme Court decides otherwise. I guess, tell us a little bit about how an individual or an organization should kind of handle this situation right now, and then any observation you have about whether other pieces of litigation are going to be happening that people should be aware of.
Yeah, no, those are very good questions. So first of all, whenever an executive order or an action of government is put in place, we live now in a world where they are often challenged, especially if they are controversial or seen as overreaching. And that's what's happened in, I think it's more than 90 instances already under the second Trump administration. You have these cases that will be brought challenging the action, whether or not the president has the power to do the enforcement. Those will be brought in a district court on behalf of people who are impacted by those executive orders. In other words, by people who have, as they say, standing to do that. The district court has a couple of different options, and we've seen that play out in this instance, where the first thing is that they can literally, as you indicated, Congressman, they can block enforcement of an executive order nationwide until such time as the litigation can be sorted out and they can determine whether or not the people who are bringing the lawsuit actually have a case to make. So, for example, we brought litigation on the day that the president was sworn into office, when he signed the birthright citizenship executive order. That order was blocked by a district court nationwide. And so that order will not be in effect now until that litigation is resolved. In some other instances, and we've seen this most often in the cases where people have brought litigation, for example, as employees of a particular federal agency that were concerned about actions that either the administration was taking or that the so-called DOJ was taking, where those orders might be limited just to employees from that department. So that's one of the places that that's a little bit of a difference in terms of how widespread an order might be in those instances. And I should say that, we've seen in the past several years, if you really go back, I think, to the Bush II administration, district court judges much more regularly issuing these kind of nationwide injunctions against actions. It happened during the Obama administration. It happened during Trump 1. It happened during Biden. And we're seeing that play out again. In terms of litigation, I think you're going to see going forward, I think that a lot of the kind of the so-called anti-DEI measures or anti-woke measures are the places where you haven't seen a lot of litigation yet. I think in some ways there's been a desire on the part of people to see how those are actually implemented. Many of them simply required government agencies to report back within 30 days or 90 days, and that there would be an announcement of policy from that point. So you're likely, it's hard to say that the government can't do a study of something, or that the executive branch shouldn't look at a question if they think it's important. So I think you're going to see, once those reports come back and they begin to actually roll out policies around those areas, I think that's when you'll see litigation around those matters.
Got it. Okay, I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. First off, how can we help someone who's caught up in what is believed to be an illegal deportation? No rights, just instantly removed from U.S. soil. And what about the potential of any U.S. citizens caught up in that? What can you say about this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that we've been recommending to people in this area. The first is I think that as all of us need to make sure that everybody in our community understands, what our rights are when we're interacting with ICE, right? Even as non-citizens, even ICE enforcing federal civil immigration law, the reality is that we all have rights in those circumstances. So making sure that people know, for example, that they don't have to open a door unless there's actually a judicial warrant, a warrant that's been approved by a judge, that they can show that warrant, that they say explicitly who they're looking for, recognizing that no one else in the home or in the business needs to provide any other information to ICE officers once they enter the building or the business or the location. So I think knowing all of those things. The second thing is that we've been encouraging people to do is know who's providing immigration counsel to people, and having that information handy. In the Chicago area, for example, our friends at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, the National Immigrant Justice Center, and a number of other organizations provide that kind of representation, making sure that people in our community know those resources, know how to contact them, have that information handy. People have been writing it on their arms or on their body somewhere, and then that family members are in touch with those people as soon as someone gets taken into detention, so that a lawyer or someone can instantly be about the business of trying to catch up and connect with them. It is a reality. I'll just say this one last thing. I think one of the things we worry about in these, this idea of mass deportation, are American citizens who don't necessarily carry a passport or a birth certificate or something like that with them all the time, could be swept up in that. We saw that a little bit in 2018 in some sweeps around the Chicago area. And so that is something that we do very, very much worry about.
Okay. Next question. It's slightly related, but with the president canceling temporary protected status, also known as TPS, are Ukrainian refugees going to lose their legal status in the U.S., or is this, what's your understanding here? And by the way, again, if anybody has specific questions, please contact me, and our office will try to help you, whether it's in this case of this U.S. citizen supposedly getting caught up in a deportation, or in the refugee situation, or TPS.
Yeah.
But Ed, what do you want to say?
Thus far, the rollback of TPS, or temporary protections, under the administration has been limited to people from Haiti and from Venezuela. And as we know, that is, I think at last count, that's about 50,000 folks across the country, who now make themselves eligible for deportation. And remember, because they've had this temporary protective status, all of those folks have registered, given their addresses, given information to the government. And I think many of them now feel targeted in that way as a result. Thus far, we have not heard of people from who've come from Ukraine as being caught up in that, although we know that President Biden extended TPS protection to folks from Ukraine after the start of the war. So I think that that is something that I would be monitoring. I think, again, even if I had temporary protective status from another country, I think this is a time to be talking to, your office, to be talking to legal counsel, to look at what one's options are, because it is true. Immigration law is one of the most complex kinds of law that there is, and there are often multiple claims that one has to remain in the United States. And so having someone who's analyzed your case and is able to make an argument quickly can be incredibly important.
Let me touch on a couple other things. By the way, one of the questions will all of Trump's actions come down to what the Supreme Court decides? Well, I think a lot of it will be decided in the Supreme Court to the extent there's litigation and it actually escalates to the Supreme Court, such as the birthright citizenship case. Someone else asked me, well, with the size of our national debt, don't we need to cut costs? If they go too far, can't we just fix it later? You are correct, except that's why we have the legislative process. And so we should do this the right way. And where somebody wishes to cut a program or change a program or modify, the proper way is to go through the legislative branch, through Congress, and then to have the executive weigh in during that time. Ed, another question. Okay. What is your opinion? How does DOGE kind of fit into the way that you think about these executive orders? How do they kind of factor into your thought process here?
I think there's a couple of different ways, Congressman. I think number one, and I almost hesitate, but I think we all probably find ourselves saying this. The idea of analyzing government like any other entity for efficiency is one that, all of us broadly support. We want to be efficient, effective. We want to be funding the right kinds of programs. I think the two things are that we're concerned about with DOGE is, number one, the idea that DOGE seems to at least claim the power to close down federal agencies that Congress has created and funded. Again, a president has a right to appoint the people that they want to carry out policies within agencies. The president has a right to examine the work that those agencies do and set priorities. But it is Congress that creates a federal government agency, not the president alone. And so I think that function, the way in which, DOGE has said they're going to close down USAID, whatever we all think about USAID, the fact of the matter is that it should only be closed, with approval from Congress. And then the second thing that I would say is that, it is really critical that DOGE, whatever it's doing, not be able to access, personal data and not have people access the personal data of millions of Americans who, who've had to share that information with the government, whether it's to pay our taxes or seek a benefit of some sort, or et cetera. It's really critical that the federal privacy laws that Congress has put in place to protect that data remain, despite the fact that we had a change in administration on January 20th. And so I think that privacy area and, again, sort of the government structural area is the thing that we mainly worry about when it comes to DOGE.
I'm going to ask three questions at once because they're very, very similar. One person says, what can I do to help stop the administration from harming the government, I guess the structure of our government?
Right.
The other question is, what are you doing, meaning me, to keep us safe during this time? from the administration. And then a third question is, what can we all do more in this time to prevent? Well, I guess let me take me for one. I think, look, I think we need to do at least 4 things. And I'm working on all 4. First, we have to absolutely, bring accountability and transparency to what's actually happening right now. We tried to actually subpoena Elon Musk before the Oversight Committee. We came 1 vote short of doing that, but that's very important because we need to get to the bottom of actually what's happening. There's a lot of information out there. It feels like a cloud of dust, but we need to actually come to terms with exactly what is DOGE doing, who's in there, and what are their designs. Secondly, litigation from within Congress, we need to promulgate. And of course, there's litigation outside as ACLU, states attorneys generals, and others are pursuing. Third, we have our votes. That's extremely important. Donald Trump and others are going to rely in part on Democrats to help fund government, to lift the debt ceiling, and for other purposes. And we need to use those votes as leverage for the proper functioning of government. That is extremely important. So just as an example, whether it's with regard to these executive orders and making sure that they don't get implemented in a way that irreversibly damages our government, or with our programs not being cut or gutted, such as Medicaid, which is on the chopping block, by the way. We have to make sure that that doesn't happen, and our votes can help to ensure that. The fourth and final thing is you have to continue to hold us accountable. That means me, that means my colleagues, that means my Republican and Democratic colleagues, on where do they stand on these issues? How exactly are they going to proceed with regard to these different matters? I think you should absolutely hold every one of us to account. Okay, Ed, I have a question. What should an individual do, and what more do people need to do with regard to executive orders? And which executive orders do you agree with?
So I'm going to go on the record as agreeing with the one about the straws. I think that's a good one, and we all can find one that we agree with. I think in terms of what we as individuals can do and should be doing more of, I want to pick up on the point you made, but say a couple of things. I think number one, we have to keep our eye on what the administration is doing, not always what they say. And I think there's a tendency sometimes for many of us, and I count myself in this group, to get outraged at the latest thing that was said, or a meme that shows the president with a crown on like a king. Those are things that aren't really going to move us forward, as opposed to making sure we're paying attention to where they're trying to take away the congressional power of the purse. And so I think being focused in that way, staying informed about those things, is really critical. The second thing I would identify is, I think you really need to talk to, friends and neighbors and others. I will just tell a quick story. About 2 weeks ago now, I went down to Pekin High School, and I was with their government classes for the day. And we were talking about the structure of government. And there was a young man who had a shirt which I think probably indicated his support for the president. And we were talking about the structure of government, and somebody said something about separation of powers. I said, why is that important? And he raised his hand and he said, because it's really important that no one person have, and you could just see it kick in. And he slowed down and said, too much power. People generally agree that our structure of government shouldn't be changed with one president. And so therefore, talking to people about what's happening or why it's happening, I think is important, and cutting through efforts at disinformation and misinformation are critical. And then the last thing is the one the Congressman mentioned, which is we need to, continue to tell our elected officials that this is important to us, that it really matters the way our structure works, and that we're actually, concerned about assuring that we don't end up with an all-powerful executive and literally no need to have a Congress.
Let me ask you about another big topic in these questions that's coming up, which is with regard to our federal workforce. You know, there are about 44,000 federal employees in Illinois. 1% of employees in my district are in the federal workforce. The questions tend to be about concerns about these mass firings or the I guess the pressure emails that people are receiving. How do you think about those? I mean, there's obviously that initial email that people receive, which is called the fork in the road email, that basically gave people a chance to do a deferred resignation and have a receive compensation for the time that they are not necessarily in the office until the time that they officially resign. And then recently we saw you know, these emails that Elon Musk requested, asking people to, you know, give people an account of their time in the last week. How do you think about these? First, what's happening with the federal workforce and the layoffs of the probationary workers, the resignation, deferred resignation, and then how people are handling this current situation with the what you see in the news?
Yeah. So I think first of all, it's hard not to feel a lot of empathy and understanding for our friends and neighbors who are employed by the federal government, because this just must be a horribly difficult time to be in that place and to be dealing with all that they are. I think we think about these in two ways. First, every single position which is being quote unquote cut is a position which has been authorized by Congress and funded by Congress. I think one of the things that we're concerned about is what is the structure, what is the process for determining that those positions may or may not be needed, and assuring that there's some check on that just being the decision of one person who in fact is not even an elected official or even an appointee of the president, but just simply in some nether world in terms of the way that that's worked. I think the second thing that, you know, about all this that we worry about is again, it goes back to sort of privacy. There's a lot of governmental, there are a lot of governmental employees who deal with sensitive information about many of us as constituents, as citizens, as people accessing our federal government. And when you start having a department, which again is an unelected just creation of the president, when you start having that agency begin to say, tell us what you did this week, when the follow-up questions could be, well, who was this for? What was their circumstance? You could end up having a lot of information about someone shared outside of the privacy protections that we built into government service. And I think that's the other thing about all of this, that we really are concerned about. I think that was what was really a little bit corrosive and scary about the request for your top 5 bullet points for the week, because that could lead to all kinds of other questions about people and in exactly, grabbing personal information about them in a way that shouldn't be done.
So while you've been talking, we've gotten more questions. One thing that I should also mention, we're getting a lot of questions actually about people's immigration status, and that's not surprising given that we have roughly a third of our district is actually born outside of the United States. I'll just address a couple of these questions real quick. If you are a green card holder, yes, you should carry your green card with you. That is the law. I'm going to get into a lot of trouble for saying this, but I think you should be well advised about traveling internationally. You have to be super careful at this point if you're not a citizen, because when you come back, we in the past have had some very challenging situations with CBP at the ports of entry. especially if you are not at least a green card holder. Ed, as a Mexican American, should I carry, this is the question, should I carry my birth certificate around with me?
You know, it seems, I don't know that you necessarily have to. What I would say is it would be good if your family members and others knew where your birth certificate was and could access those documents quickly in the event that you had to do them. I think that's kind of, one of the things you worry about carrying that document is that you lose it, and then, replacing that is often both time consuming and expensive. And so for that reason, I think, maybe just making sure that's in a place where family members or yourself could access it very quickly.
What if, switching gears again, court rulings, let's say something goes all the way to the Supreme Court. How do you think about the situation where Donald Trump or the administration were to ignore a court ruling or defy it? And have we seen that in the past?
We have not seen that in the United States since the 19th century. I think famously Andrew Jackson, talked about the Supreme Court having made their decision, now let them enforce it. That is not something we've seen. Again, I think that one of the things that I would say, as probably both as an ACLU person and a bit of an institutionalist, is that we need to work through this process while we're working on the outside to put pressure on changing things. I think if we get to a point, we've heard some of the language from administration officials about, the president being the one who decides the law, questioning judges who rule against them. But I think at the end of the day, we should not beg the trouble of sort of looking at that catastrophization before it happens, and just assure that we're sort of dealing in the moment, making the best arguments that we can to the Supreme Court and to other courts about the unconstitutionality of many of these steps that they're taking.
I can take another couple questions, and then I want to, I'm going to get the cane here. Okay. If you are an individual and you wanted to help the ACLU, we're not talking about monetary help or anything like that, but or you wanted to avail yourself of services or information with regard to ACLU or its partners to defend our Constitution and democracy, how does that work?
Yeah. So the first thing I would encourage everybody to do is go to our website at aclu-il.org. You can get a lot of information there, a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of your rights as an immigrant, your rights when interacting with ICE, your rights in other kinds of situations. The second thing there is that there's ways to follow us, whether it's through social media or through our regular email alerts, where you can find out what we're doing in partnership with other organizations, the way in which we're sort of thinking about a lot of these issues and thinking about, protecting people's rights. If you have a specific legal problem, there's a form there that you can get to share that information with us. We treat all of those as being, attorney-client protected. So you can share information about your individual situation in a way that we can look at whether or not we can help you, or whether some other organization is better suited to help you out with those. So those are, I think, some ways that you can do that pretty quickly.
Someone just asked me, is birthright citizenship, if it is overturned, will people who receive their citizenship that way lose it? My understanding, Ed, is that this is prospective, right?
Right. And it's I'm thankful for the question, and your answer is correct. It was all prospective, and so nobody loses their birthright citizenship as a result.
Right. It's still, in my opinion, illegal, and
yeah,
whether it's prospective or otherwise, but it was meant to be applied going forward.
Correct.
Okay, we have a lot of questions about budgetary issues as well. Let me ask you this. I guess, are there avenues in state courts to potentially challenge these federal executive orders, or does everything get removed from state court to federal court when it gets brought in state court at this point?
It's going to depend. And I think this is one of the very interesting things that we don't fully know yet, Congressman. There are some ways in which, and just to use an example, there are some ways in which some of these orders could have an impact on people who are covered under the Illinois Human Rights Act, for example, could have a discriminatory impact on folks under the IHRA. And if that were the case, those people could perhaps bring their complaint not in a federal court, but in either through the Illinois Human Rights Division or Department, forgive me, or through a state court relying on Illinois law. And that's one of the interesting features of our Constitution, which I think we're about to all get a civics lesson about, which is, constitutional rights, and we all talk about those, have always basically been a floor. They're really just a telling of what it is that government cannot go below, but they've never been the ceiling. And many states, including Illinois, have put in protections that have built on federal protections, have done so through, as you know, through our modern Constitution in Illinois, which was adopted in 1972. So frankly, the language around privacy and other things is much clearer and much sharper than it was in the 18th century constitutional language. And so I think that it's one of the things that we're going to see. It's going to be very interesting because as these orders actually if they were to get rolled out, if they were to be upheld and then applied, I think you could see a lot of action in state courts that would look at their individual application to people in a state like Illinois.
It's a fascinating question, and if it weren't so personal to so many people, it would be fascinating just from an academic standpoint. But this is like real stuff. So,
right.
In any case, I have so many other questions that have come in, but I see that we're at the end of our time. I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you, Ed, for your incredible knowledge that you've shared with us. And again, if you need my help on anything, please contact me at 847-413-1959 or contact us by the website or il08.helpline@mail.house.gov. And I just want to say thank you. We will do everything we can to help anybody who's affected by these orders or by anything that is going on right now. And Ed, thank you for your service, and thank you to everything that you do every day for the community.
Thank you, Congressman. Always good to be with you.
Thank you so much. God bless everybody.